Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. I know we haven't done this one in a while. Some stuff came up. Kobe had a little trip to the hospital. He's much better now. And some other life stuff came up. So we're back on track. I'm going to try and do one of these every other week was the plan. Every other month was not the plan, so that will not continue for the rest of the year. I have some big stuff planned for the future, and if you have any requests, leave those in the comments below. This week is the long-awaited Republic P-47. I wanted to do this last year, but I just wanted to get everything right. So I've been doing a lot of research, and I want to try to cover every aspect. This is a very, even though it wasn't, I would say, it's a pretty complicated plane, but there's also a lot of variants, and it had a very storied service life and history, and even the development was very storied as well. So we're going to start by talking about the two creators of this aircraft, and then the two airplanes that led up to this aircraft. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about why the P-47 is important, and I think Kobe actually has a personal story if you want to start off with that.
Yeah, my grandfather was a flight engineer during World War II on B-17s and B-24s and other airplanes, and he was in B-24, which on the B-24, the flight engineer, and the B-17, actually both of them, they manned the top turret. And they were on a bomb run. They were getting the shit shot out of them. I mean, they were really in trouble. They were at the back of their group, not the last airplane, but close to the last airplane, just getting shot up by a bunch of 109s. And my grandfather was almost out of ammo out of his turret. Both waist gunners were out of ammo. They were just getting crapped on. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, B-47s came along, shot down both 109s, and skedaddled. Never found out who the guys were or nothing. B-47 hadn't come by at the time that it did, I probably wouldn't be alive. Neither would my mom. And neither would my grandfather, probably. So it's kind of P-47 is kind of an important airplane to me because I wouldn't be here without it.
P-47 had a very multi-role position in World War II for the U.S. Fought Pacific. It fought on the Western Front in Europe, and it originally started out pretty much as escort duty, like Kobe just told that story. And then it was transitioned into basically, I guess you call it, dogfighting role, but it was basically, what do you call it, hunter? It went in seeking, it would try and go in and basically engage enemy fighters wherever they are, attack airfields, more of an interdictor, yeah, more of an aggressive role.
Yeah.
And then it became, by the end of the war, or I guess you call it post-Normandy, a true fighter bomber. And so this thing just kept seeing, more and more and more in action. It was in the trenches more and more. And the P-51 is kind of heralded as like the American fighter, the poster child for a lot of the posters and movies and whatever you want to call it. And to me, I think the P-47 had, it had a much bigger punch than the P-51 did. They're both very important to the war, but to me, I think the P-47 should have the podium as, the premier fighter for the U.S., at least on the Western Front. Hellcat for the Pacific, and then P-47 for the U.S. Western Front. That's just me personally, and that's what I believe. Nothing wrong with P-51. Not, shit on those who love it, but I just...
Great airplane, but it took all the limelight.
Yeah, I think it's a little... So let's start out with who created this aircraft. There's two names you should know if you don't know them already. They're both named Alexander. The first one is Seversky, who has a very... This man is just interesting, fascinating human being. The more I did research on him, I'm like, holy crap, like, what a life he had. And the other one is Kartveli, and they're both from the country of Georgia, and I believe they're actually born in the same town. But starting with the first one, Seversky, he was the top scoring ace for Russia in World War I as a naval fighter. And he attacked, I believe it was a German destroyer, if I get my story right here. He attacked it, he was shot down, and when he landed, the ordnance went off, blew up the plane, killed his spotter, and he lost a leg. They told him that you can't fly without a leg. He had I guess you call it a early 1900s prosthetic made. They still wouldn't clear him. He stole an aircraft from an air show, showed that he could still fly, was arrested, and then they put him into service after that. He went up, I think he shot down somebody, and then when he was back on the airfield, a horse-drawn wagon ran over his good leg and broke it, and so he was grounded more for that reason. But he ended up with, I have it in my notes here because I didn't want to mess this up here. How many kills did he end up with?
A lot.
It wasn't actually, well, back then. Oh my gosh. There we go, right here. 6 total air kills. So for World War I, that was a lot back then. After that, he came to the U.S. as a liaison for the Russian embassy in New York. And about that time, Russia had a little civil war problem, and he didn't want to go back because he was fearful for his life. So he became a U.S. citizen. He worked at a restaurant for about half a year at a Manhattan restaurant, and then he became, I guess you'd call it, an advocate for Billy Mitchell, who was trying to revolutionize the way that the U.S. looked at air power. Because back then, we are still trying to put money into battleships and this and that. And he was trying to explain, hey, one bomber can sink a battleship. It's a waste of time and money.
Air power is the future.
So there's from that, and then this is a very odd story. You can look this up on YouTube because it is posted. There's an hour-long movie that Walt Disney and Seversky made about victory through air power. You can watch it. It's kind of weird. It was not very well received back then because I think Pentagon was like, what the fuck does Walt Disney know about, air power? But it's still interesting to watch. It basically covers from like the Wright brothers to early World War II. And I've watched a bit of it, and it's something you should at least check out.
He was a big proponent of the Strategic Air Command that was formed after the war with Curtis LeMay as the commander.
He also had a patent on the first air-to-air refueling system. He created a bomb sight that was later bought by, I believe, the U.S. Army. And that's how and that was through, was it Spire? Is that the company's name? Sperry. Thank you, Sperry. I knew I had that wrong. That's how he opened up his first aircraft company, which was, I believe, called like Seversky Aircraft Company or something along those lines. It was during the U.S. Depression. It failed. A couple of guys from Wall Street bailed him out. He was able to create another aircraft company. And then we'll come back to this story at that point. The other one, a very important gentleman, you could probably put him right there next to Kelly Johnson, is Alexander Kartveli. I think that's fair. Those two names probably side by side for the era.
Yeah, I put him more on Ed Heineman, who was the designer at Douglas. But yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, that family, like those guys, kind of made that fraternity of
the top 1%ers.
Yeah, those guys pushed U.S. air power technology, leap years ahead of what we were able to do, or what other people are doing. I mean, Brewster, for God's sakes, like they overshadowed every other aircraft company. Anyway. Kartveli grew up in Georgia. He went to university in Paris, learned about aviation, went to United States, and he worked for, was it North Atlantic Aircraft Company, I believe? Or, sorry, just Atlantic Aircraft Corporation. I've never heard of that. Have you ever heard of that? Atlantic Aircraft Corporation?
Yeah, they're real small. There were a lot of real small companies back then that had one airplane. That was it.
And that was 1927. He worked there for about 3 or 4 years, and then he met Seversky in 1931, and he moved to the Seversky Aircraft Corporation and became the chief engineer. So that's how those two started their little, I guess you call it work marriage, right? And then from there, became the Seversky P-35. And I don't know, probably most War Thunder players are not familiar with the P-35. That's a plane that probably should be added to War Thunder sooner than later.
Needs to be added, yes.
There's 196 of them built, and you're like, well, that's not a very big production run, but it was a production aircraft that did see service. It was the U.S.'s first all-metal fighter besides control surfaces. So it was the U.S. first all-metal fighter. I did not know that. Went to production in 1938. It had numerous issues, but I believe it was one of the first aircraft that also had a retractable landing gear.
Yep,
but it also semi-retractable. It had an elliptical wing. I know everybody loves the Spitfire because it's elliptical wing. Well, Kartveli designed almost everything with an elliptical wing. And so this had an elliptical wing on it, very thin elliptical wing that the landing gear couldn't fully retract into. That has like half the wheel went into the wing, and then the other half had like a shield around it. Anyway, this aircraft, it leaked all the time. It leaked fuel. It was underpowered. It was underarmed, and it wasn't very agile. It was one of the first U.S. planes to use a twin Wasp radial engine. It had an enclosed cockpit, which was a big deal for us. Like I said, retractable landing gear. It saw action in the Philippines with the air defense there, and it immediately got its ass kicked by the Zero. It was just completely matched out. It was a disgrace. And that's why there was only 196 of them pretty much built. It had 250 cals, 230 cals, and 350 pounds of bombs. It would fit right in next to the P-36 Hawk in War Thunder, nicely.
Actually, well, that's the thing. The P-35 and the P-36 were ordered by the Army Air Corps at the same time. Kind of a Ford and Chevy kind of thing.
And the last thing I'll say about it is that the Navy, there's a naval version design with a hook and everything. but the Navy, quote, called the performance appalling. And look at the Navy aircraft that were used at that time. That had to be really bad aircraft to be better than...
Pretty shitty airplane.
Yeah. I did see one of these in real life. There's in Orlando, there's a gentleman named Kermit Weeks who's restoring one to flying condition. And it was about probably 40% done when I saw it. And you look at it, and it's actually a really small aircraft with its wings off anyway. I just saw the fuselage. And the first thing I thought when walking into the hangar was, holy crap, it's like a little baby P-47. Basically, the P-47 design came from this first aircraft, and it grew into the plane we're going to talk about next, which is the P-43. But basically, the evolution of this aircraft became the Jug. And so the P-43 came around in 1941, I think, ish.
1940, maybe even 39.
200.
I think it was 1940.
I think it was 1941. Anyway, before early World War, before U.S. got involved. 272 total built. I think they only built 272 of these because they were waiting on the P-47. The P-47 was at this point their goal. They knew that the Pratt & Whitney R2800 was going to come down the line sooner or later. That engine kept getting delayed due to design issues, or you would call it production issues, or whatever reason. And so they kept kind of ordering these P-43s as a stopgap until the P-47 project was viable. Upgrades to this aircraft was that it was the first one with a Razorback fuselage. We're going to talk about the Razorback versus bubble canopy. You want to talk real quick what a Razorback looks like? So I know there's some confusion.
Razorback fuselage is kind of like what the ME-109 looks like, where it's got a square canopy, and then it's faired into the back of the airplane, so you can't really look directly behind you because there's a bulkhead there.
And then the bubble canopy, which was much harder to manufacture, came around years later, which is what's on the P-51 and the P-51Ds and the Spitfires and
P-47 that's in the game.
The later P-47s.
Yeah, the D-25 that's in War Thunder was the very first variant to have the bubble canopy. All the ones before it had the old Razorback canopy.
Yeah, so the Razorback I think is a little bit sexier look, but obviously pilots want the bubble canopy because you can look behind you. Visibility is always important. The P-43 had a 3-blade propeller. It had a supercharged Pratt & Whitney 1830 engine, so it was able to produce 1,200 horsepower. We're going to talk about superchargers. Superchargers are very important at this point. Kartveli believed in supercharging the engines. The Army had an obsession with turbochargers, which is where they didn't see quite eye to eye. And early superchargers, this technology altogether was, I guess you want to call it unpredictable, or it was hard to get it consistent. And we'll quickly talk about the supercharger versus turbocharger in early U.S. manufacturing.
Well, supercharger and turbocharger are two separate things, and there's actually a third thing called the turbo supercharger, which was on the P-47 and on the 51. One is exhaust driven, the other one is not, pretty much. One's before the exhaust, one's after the exhaust. What it does is it pumps in more air to the engine, so it makes the engine think that it's at its lower altitude. As you gain altitude, the air gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So if you put something like that on the airplane, it boosts the available horsepower per altitude. Some airplanes are boosted really good, like the P-47, the later ones. There was pretty much full power up to like 25, 30,000 feet, which is unheard of. And that thing just must have been screaming. Basically what it is, it's a little turbine that just spins and pumps air back into the engine. And that turbine, depending on the airplane, was spinning about 35,000 RPM.
Jesus Christ.
It's just...
Well, that's why you hear that whine of the Corsairs and the Hellcats before you hear that,
and the Spitfire
that
and
mean,
else like that.
That
and
mean
the
scream.
Mustang, actually, the Mustang, the very first thing that you hear when you listen to a Mustang in real life is the turbo supercharger spooling.
So that was... Kartveli started messing with that in the P-43. The P-43 actually had really good high-altitude performance for a early 1940s aircraft. That was the only thing it excelled at. It still lacked agility, it still lacked quality control, it still leaked fuel, and it didn't have any armor for the pilot, but the one thing the P-43 had was high-altitude performance. So it was a decent airplane, I guess you'd say, overall. I think the most combat action it might have seen was with the AVG in China, the volunteer group, basically the Flying Tigers.
And the Nationalist Chinese as well. The nationalist Chinese ordered a bunch of them.
And once that plane got replaced with something better, they did keep them in service as trainers and recon aircraft for a while. I don't know what year they phased them out over there. It's a little hard to find that, specific information.
There's no way to tell.
But it was a decent plane. But from this, you had the P-47 project start. The most important prototype, there's a lot of P-47 prototypes, and I don't want to bore you guys to death by, going through all of them. But I think the one that you want to point at if you want to research this more is the XP-47B, which is kind of the, if you want to call it, the mutant hybrid between the P-43 and the P-47.
The XP-47B was built on a P-43 airplane that wasn't picked up by the Air Force.
Basically, they shoved an R-2800 on nearly a P-43 airframe. It is a funky-looking aircraft. It had all metal construction, except for the control surfaces again. Had self-sealing fuel tanks, which was a big deal for them. A big thing for America. I mean, that was the beginning of one of the things that made us, versus the Japanese, this was one of our big advantages, was armor. Had increased fuel capacity, so bigger range. Had the R-2800 double WAS 18-cylinder radial engine with a supercharger that produced, what's that thing, about 2,000 horsepower-ish?
Something like that,
2,100-ish. 4-bladed propeller. Empty, this aircraft weighed 9,900 pounds, which is 2/3 more weight than a normal P-43. So this is a big, big girl. It had 8 50 cals, which each pulled from their individual ammo box in the wing. And the prototype was able to hit 412 miles an hour in level flight. So this thing was screaming for, I guess, that time frame. I don't know if there's anything else that was comparable in the U.S. arsenal to this.
Probably not really. Nothing like that.
It did a 5-minute climb to 15,000 feet, and the climb was something that the P-47 struggled with quite a bit. And the P-47, we're trying to talk it up as like the greatest aircraft ever. I want to talk about next. It had a lot of developmental issues.
It was not without its faults, that's for sure.
Early on, you're going to hear the term P-47 Bravo and Charlie, the B's and C's. The very early Razorbacks. I wish I'd say, the P-47 went into service without issues. There's a reason there's so many variants and production models. The original B's had the little issue of the, I guess you could call it, the tail section wasn't quite up to par. And I think they had one or two instances, I know there's a famous one over in New York, where the tail just flew off. And that pilot died, I believe. So they had to fix that issue. Also, the center of gravity of the aircraft was completely messed up. You look at it's huge. They could not get the aircraft's zero gravity correct, so they actually put in a massive firewall in the cockpit, or in front of the cockpit, as basically a lead weight, essentially. Well, the Japanese did do that, lead weights to balance the aircraft. Anyway, we put a...
Still do that today.
Yeah. But anyway, put a firewall right there to balance out the aircraft, so it's even more armor. This aircraft had metal control surfaces. It had... General Electric, I believe, picked up the Supercharger, so they were creating that, which helped with the reliability issues. Heavily armored. The P-47, let's talk about that real quick. The P-47, even from this point, was one of the, I guess you call it the most armored aircraft. It was it and like the IL-2 for basically flying pieces of steel. The P-47, the pilot, the cockpit is surrounded in, you want to talk about that, how much armor the cockpit is alone?
A lot of it.
A lot of it.
Most of the weight of the airplane is around the cockpit. There's steel everywhere. Rolled steel everywhere, behind them, on the sides, on the floor, on the firewall.
Armored glass in front of you.
Places. Yep, armored glass. Except for the bubble canopy. Well, yeah.
Well, the bubble canopy isn't.
Canopies might have had they might have had armored glass in the front. I don't know.
Well, they had that like piece of, I don't know. I have to look at, I guess, again in the game, but you also had this massive R-2800 engine that would suck up a few cannon rounds for you as well and keep running.
Everything, exactly.
So you're gonna hear these stories on documentaries, primarily U.S. documentaries, that say, "Oh, the P-47 took 1,000 rounds from that 190 and flew." It may have happened once or twice. I mean, it was still an aircraft. Aircrafts are fragile by nature. Just because the P-47 could take some punishment from flak, it could take some rounds and keep chugging. Especially the engine. The engine, you hit that thing, you could throw 2 or 3 cylinders. You'll see pictures online of P-47 soaked basically from the front to back in oil, and they were still able to land the thing. That engine was probably one of the best radials made during the war. This plane was hard to take down, which is why I think it saw a lot of action as a fighter bomber, getting in low and sucking up that ground fire. pilots, the other thing I want to mention is that pilots actually, if it came to a choice of doing a low altitude bailout or just crash landing, a lot of pilots would just crash land it and then get out and be fine. About 90% of the time I was reading, pilots that crash landed on airfields or fields just walked away fine. It was like a big safety, I guess, I don't know what you call it, but safety bubble. Your safety bubble.
So well built, that's why that thing was just ridiculous.
Yeah, so that's where it gets the name Juggernaut. I mean, it's called Jug because of the milk jug shape, and then it became Juggernaut because the fucking thing can't die. There's actually a story of one of these things that was taxiing and it drove through a brick wall and kept in service. So the airplane went through wall and it was fine for the most part. The aircraft was very roomy inside, a lot of room for the pilot, very comfortable. It also had a lot of features like cabin air conditioning, which must have been nice in the Pacific Theater. Good visibility, except for trying to see over that massive propeller on the front. And we go into the P-47Bs. There's 171 of those made. Most of those, I think, were early tests and trials. And I think they became like trainer aircraft. They weren't ever really sent overseas for action quite yet. The C model, which 602 were built, those were the ones that I believe initially went to England, right, for action.
Yeah.
They had tons of changes. There's also a centerline hardpoint added to the C, so it could drop a fuel tank underneath. And then there's going to be lots of little changes like antenna whips. In the C-5 variant, WEP became water methanol injection. Came when the aircraft does use WEP, it's 2300 HP, 2300 horsepower. You really quickly want to talk about water methanol injection, so people who don't know what WEP is when it comes to
water methanol injection is a combination of liquid methanol and water and distilled water. And basically, what it does is it's shot into the engine to cool the cylinder head temperature to make the airplane produce more horsepower. It's only good for just a short time. You can only use it for maybe 5 minutes or so, and then the engine would have to be looked at by the mechanics and possibly even overhauled. It's really overboosts the engine. It's not very good for it, but it's there just in case you need it. WEP stands for War Emergency Power.
If you put on a ton of bombs and rockets and, if you do like a max load with max fuel and everything, like put the plane to max capacity, don't they usually use WEP to try to get it off the deck faster?
Yeah, that's very normal. You do max power takeoff all the time if you're really heavily loaded, absolutely. But it's not, it's only good for just a couple minutes.
So we talked about the B and C, and that's all I want to talk about the B and C because I don't think it's that important. I mean, it's important to know, but it's not the main variants. Most of the main variants are going to be P-47D models. And like we mentioned, half of those are Razorbacks, the other half are bubble canopies. There was 12,602 D models made. That's a lot of aircraft. And these things cost, I think, back then around $85,000, which comes out to a million something today. Insanity. It was about...
That's pretty cheap, actually.
Well, today, yeah. But back then, I think 109s cost between, like 35,000, I think the Germans were paying for them. And this thing cost at least twice or three times more than other fighters. But max speed of the D model was 430 miles an hour. That's about 700 kilometers. Range was 3,000 kilometers. Service ceiling was 42,000 feet, which is 13,000 meters. That's insane. And the aircraft weighed 10,500 pounds empty. Fully loaded, she could go somewhere north of 20,000 pounds. So about 21,000 pounds fully loaded. The changes to the D variant was they put even more armor on the frickin' aircraft. It could carry drop tanks on its wings. They actually ran fuel lines out to the wings so it could do drop tanks on the wings. How common was that in most fighters back then?
It was pretty common late war. The Mustang had it. P-47 had it. Pretty common. Great way to extend the range of the airplane. They're jettisonable, so what they would actually, they'd take off on the main tank, and then once they were off the ground, they'd switch to the drop tanks and burn the gas out of the drop tanks first. So if they needed to drop them, they would be
empty,
gone.
The biggest change to the D model that was probably the most important one, besides the canopy to note, is the propeller change. The original propeller is made by Hamilton, and then they switched to a
Hamilton standard.
Yeah, then they switched to a Curtiss propeller. And you're like, well, how does the propeller make a big difference? The Curtiss propeller was, I guess you call it like a paddle prop. It was also 2 inches longer.
Yeah, it was wider. It had a cuff on it.
So the problem with the P-47 was it could not climb. The Germans kind of laughed at it because the plane could not climb basically to save its life sometimes. And we fixed that by putting the world's biggest ass propeller on it. And it actually had very little clearance for the runway. So pilots you would have to actually get to speed and then pull straight up. You couldn't put, like when you roll, I guess you would call it, when you roll to a certain speed and then you put the aircraft level. You know what I'm trying to say? When you balance the aircraft on its front wheels, you know this stuff better than I do. What's that called?
Well, exactly what you called it.
All right. Anyway, the propeller would been known to hit the runway, so pilots wouldn't take off. They actually apply the elevator, the opposite direction, until they had enough airspeed to take off, because the propeller would hit the runway sometimes. They would also have to flare the aircraft so that it would land with the propeller, an upward angle, so it didn't hit the runway. Hellcat kind of had the same issues too, right? Where the propeller hit. Yeah. I think it's R2800 issue all around.
Well, it's just a big prop. The bigger prop that you put on an airplane, the more poop you get out of it. P-47 had a massive prop on it, and actually the Corsair did as well. But they fixed the Corsair by putting the gull wing on the airplane and lowering the landing gear, making it shorter so that the prop stuck up a little bit higher.
The last D model that I want to mention, and we're in the sake of specs and technical information, is the D40, which had an extended dorsal fin. Dorsal fins usually helped with stability. The neat part is it had a computing gun sight that would change the convergence of where you're shooting at. Very, very neat stuff for, I guess, 45, yeah.
Same gun sight.
Then you had the G model, which isn't that important to know. We're going to mention it. The P-47G model, which probably won't come to War Thunder, is just a Curtiss-built aircraft.
Same airplane as the D, just built in a different factory.
Republic could not build enough P-47s, so there's nothing different. It's the same thing as the D model, just built with Curtiss. And then you had the P-47M. This is the two models I suspect that maybe War Thunder will get as the P, or either the M or the N.
Hopefully the N, the November.
So the P-47M, if you've never heard of that, it's kind of I don't want to call it a rarity, but it wasn't a primary model. It was a high-performance...
Only one group used it.
Yeah, it was a very small production. There's only 130 of them built, so it was not in a scheme of P-47s, that was nothing. P-47M was a high-performance sprint variant that was designed to take down V-1 rockets crossing the channel. The problem with it was they could not get the R-2800 to run at that type of high performance consistently and reliably. So I guess you call that project a little bit of a failure?
I don't think it was a failure. It was an experiment.
It was too late to make.
Experiment.
It came into service too late to really do anything like it was supposed to. It did kill 15 enemy aircraft though, so that worked. It also had 6 machine guns on it. They reduced the 50 cals to 6 instead of 8. Then you have the N variant, which is probably going to be the top dog, or it is the last one made anyway, so it is the top dog. The P-47N is made in late 44. It was designed to escort B-29s and had increased fuel and range. The P-51 took over this role because the P-47 had pretty lackluster fuel and range. And I think this was, I guess you call it Republic's shot to try and take back the escort role.
Yeah, it had a different wing on it. It had a much bigger wing on it than the D model, and it was a wet wing, so the entire thing was basically a big giant gas tank. It held 200 more gallons, I believe, than the D model.
And then that's about all I want to talk about for the P-47 models and stuff. If you guys have any questions, there's a lot of knowledgeable viewers. Go ahead and ask freely. I'm sure somebody else or Cobey and I can try to answer it for you. The P-47, this is really complex because you're going to see D-25, D-26, D-28. I'm just making up numbers here, but there probably are real models that say that. And each one was just you call an order, like they would order this many with that design. And when I say design, it would be they changed the wiring or they changed...
Yeah, it's called a production block. Whenever they would change something, they would make a new production block.
And it doesn't necessarily mean it's better or drastically different. It could be just a little slight change, a different mirror. And it would get a different production block sometimes.
Exactly.
So it doesn't mean anything. It means something, but it's not, performance-wise usually. The Thunderbolt ended the war with 3,752 air-to-air kills, which is I'd say that's pretty good. It ended with 3,500 of them lost, and most of that was probably due to the aircrafts. These aircraft saw a lot of service, a lot of airtime, a lot of sorties, and I'm going to assume some of those were just lost to the aircraft tired, worn out, and then you have the whole flying low to the ground and attacking ground targets. You probably have a lot of pilot error sometimes, hitting trees, like you see more thunder. Crap happens, but also you have a lot of anti-air that, the Germans threw up every piece of anti-air they could in late war trying to knock these things down. So, very brave pilots flew these things in the face. Same thing with the L-2s. Those ground attackers were very brave pilots who went in, to do what had to be done. This aircraft, though, was, like I said, the fighter bomber role was where it shined. 86,000 rail cars blown up, 9,000 locomotives. 9,000 locomotives. That's insane. 6,000 armored vehicles and 68,000 trucks. That will do hell on your supply lines. Victory through air power. We're going to quote, Gabreski. I want to real quickly tell a quick story. Well, let's talk about the Pacific Theater real quick. You will see P-47s on carriers. I found these pictures kind of interesting. There is a neat documentary on Xenos Warbirds of them building a P-47 in a jungle. It's like a P-47 in a box. In about 45 minutes, 6 mechanics have a P-47 built together. It's amazing. Basically, no tools required. They take the thing out of the box, and then they use the box as the tool to build the P-47 in the jungle. Absolutely amazing what people were capable back then. The people who flew this plane, primarily are going to tell a lot of story about the 56 Fighter Group. Those guys alone had 674 kills in World War II.
The Wolf Pack.
Yeah, this is where, if you want to look up P-47 U.S. Aces, most of them were with this unit. This is where, and the person I'm going to talk about now is Gabreski. He was with this unit, and he is I believe he ended up being the top scoring P-47 ace.
Yes.
People requested I tell a story about the aircraft so you get to better know who flew it. Gabreski he was a Polish, I believe his family's Polish immigrants to, I think, Pennsylvania, and he enlisted with the U.S. Army. He saw action a little bit earlier than most U.S. pilots because he was able to go to the RAF after the Battle of Britain and serve as a translator to the Polish unit. The Polish most of them didn't speak English, so he was a translator between the British and the Polish. And so he learned from some of the best Polish pilots, Polish Spitfire pilots trained him, get up close and personal. Those guys were phenomenal pilots. And so he kind of learned from the best. And then he was initially, I think about the time the U.S. showed up, they pulled him back to the 56th. And he went basically from, I think, like an F Mark 9 Spitfire to a P-47. And in his words, it was going from a sports car to a freight train. And initially, he kind of saw the P-47. He was like, how the hell can this thing fly? And he said, then you fly, and it was easy to fly, and it was addicting. The power was just addicting. He said there was nothing else like it. Then he started a roll. He never actually got a kill in the Spitfire. All his kills came from P-47. And the stories this man has, the 850 cals, he talked about how, I guess you call it like a mini hurricane develops in front of the R-2800. And they had to land quite a bit and dig out shrapnel from their engine from just the debris that would fly off what they were shooting. But there's actually a story of him having to pull out about half a German, I think it was a Bf-110 he attacked, and there was about half of a German jacket stuck in his engine that he had to pull out. And
that's disgusting.
And that's when, like, he said it was a very sobering moment for him. Like, it's just sad. How, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know what to say about that. It's just a story that, I saw in his biography. After that, though, he went on and became the top scoring ace. Usually when you became the top scoring ace for the U.S., at a certain point, you would be, I guess you call it relieved from your command and be returned back to stateside to sell war bonds. And in his case, he was going to get married, and he's going to go sell some war bonds, and that was basically going to be the end of his war. Except the day, I think he had about a couple days free before he was scheduled to go back, and he saw that there was on the next sortie on the board, there was a name missing because nobody was scheduled for that flight, and his P-47 was still around, so he's like, well, screw it, I'm going to go fly. So he, I guess you call it, kind of broke orders, snuck in, flew with those guys. I mean, of course, they were happy to see him. Flew, nothing happened on the initial flight in, and then on the flight back, they saw an airfield. He went down, I think he strafed like HE-111s or some type of bomber was down there. He strafed at one or two, came back up, and then he wasn't done. He saw more, so he came back around, and by this time the German AA was on his ass, and they started firing. So in his mind, he was going to fly below the AA. That sounds like something Cobey and I would try in War Thunder. He was going to fly below the AA, so he kept getting lower and lower as the Germans were getting their guns depressed more and more. And then that big propeller hit the ground, and that was the end of that. So he skipped up above the hangars, and then from the words from his pilot, the other American pilots, is that they saw the P-47 go up above the hangars, and then you saw about a mile-long streak of dirt from where the P-47 was sliding. And the last time they saw Mr. Gabreski was getting out of the canopy, running, through a field with Germans coming out of the airfield chasing him. He ended up going to a POW camp where the rest of the 56 aces were hanging, so all of them got to hang out until the end of the war. They actually were treated very well, he said. But that's just the P-47 was a very, I guess you call it, violent aircraft. And it saved his life. I don't know, would a P-51 survive something like that, you think?
Probably for a little bit, but not nearly as long as the P-47. The thing was a freaking tank.
Yeah, the way it just, hit the ground and then kind of skim back up and then slide across. So that's P-47. We're going to talk a little bit about its post-war life, and then we're going to retire the podcast on that point. The P-47 never saw action in Korea, and this is a very hot topic for when you look back and say what if. And the what if question is, if the P-51, I'll let Cobey talk about this, the P-51 saw action in Korea, the P-47 did not, and you probably have some opinion about this.
A lot of opinion about it. The P-47 and the P-51 were both in Air Force Reserve and National Guard service starting in 1945. There were more P-47s available than there were Mustangs. So when the Korean War started in 1950 and the 5th Air Force found a need for a ground attack airplane, the people that were in charge of the Air Force at the time were all ex-51 pilots. So they chose the P-51 over the P-47, and consequently, a lot of guys died. We lost a lot of Mustangs because they didn't like the P-47. The P-47 was a much better airplane for that role, but it never got a chance to do it. And it stayed in service until 1953, 1954, when it was finally pulled out of service.
It's important to know, it did see service with countries like Brazil, Mexico, there's a whole list of them. This thing did see life in other countries as well.
The British,
Russians had some
down the Pacific. Yeah.
So it did see a lot of international use. The last thing I want to say, though, real quick, go back to Gabreski, is he actually served in Korea, but not in the P-47. Obviously, he went to the Sabre, and I think he became an ace also in a Sabre, shooting down MiG-15s.
He was, yep. So, he's one of a very small group of people that were aces in both wars.
So he's part of that. I just wanted to bring that up since Korea's mentioned. If you have any questions or comments, let us know. We've always felt that the P-47 was an underutilized tool in War Thunder. Starting out when Cobey and I first started back in weight 1.29, the P-47 had shitty performance, and it just didn't work right. The damage model wasn't right. The performance numbers weren't right. And the P-47, I think we have a much better flight model now, but it still doesn't feel proper. And if you're asked, what is a P-47 flight model, I can't give you those answers. The thing was actually very complex. Very weird airplane in the terms of comparing it to other things. There are some tests out there. I'll say this real quick. You ask, how can an airplane that weighed 10,000 pounds, empty, fly well? It actually tested that above 250 miles an hour, it rolled and did outchurn the 198.5. So at high speed, this aircraft, with that elliptical wing, moved pretty, I guess you call it, pretty agile. Below that speed, the airplane was kind of a slug. It had to do wider churns, and it didn't stall out necessarily, but it had to do, much more exaggerated churns to still accomplish the goal. So from that aspect, the P-47 was actually a pretty nimble aircraft at speeds. The other thing the P-47 always needs to be noticed is that it was one of the best diving aircraft of World War II. But there's a number it has to get right. There's a difference between, I guess you call it initial dive and then top dive speed, right? And so the 109 was actually better in the initial dive. The P-47 actually kind of had to slowly roll over, and then it just picked up a shit ton of airspeed. So initially the 109 would beat it in the dive, and then the P-47 would just clobber it from behind. P-47s actually liked when the Germans tried to dive away from them because it was, it didn't lock up as quickly, or what's the proper terms. If you look, it's called uncontrolled crash at that point. If you go on the World War II test performance, there's actually some numbers. I'm not saying these are normal numbers, but there's some crazy numbers of logged dive speeds that P-47 pilots had. And I'm not saying ever use these for War Thunder flight model numbers, but the aircraft could pick up a shit ton of speed in the dive due to its weight and power. So I just want to mention that. I don't think the flight model is quite perfect yet. It's much better than where it needed to be. The R2800 engine is always something I felt was a little too soft in the game across the board for all of them. And so the plane's going to keep evolving, especially when I think we're probably going to see some B and C model P-47s. And then we're going to probably initially see the N model. So this is a plane that you can see how many like BF-109s Germany has in the tech tree right now. I'd like to see the P-47 be closer to that. Not saying it deserves that many, but I think there should be at least 6 to 7 P-47 models in game because it was that important of an aircraft. Would you agree? You think that would be?
Yep.
And then its two little brothers, the P-35 and 43. So I'll leave it on that point. If you have any questions, like I said, feel free to leave them in comments. I'm going to try and do one of these every other week, and sometimes it gets hard to pull it together and scheduling conflicts. And like I said, Kobe was ill, and I had some family stuff, and life happens. But I apologize, we did it now. And we're here for you if you have any questions. I'll take any suggestions for future podcasts. As always, thanks for listening. We will catch you later.
Bye.